Hi, Stanley Casselman, and let me first say what an honor it is to be here, not only a part of this discussion, but to have my work in Gazzelli Art House. Mila, thank you very much for your belief in my work. Matthew Collings, critic, artist, very talented artist, by the way. I have to say I stumbled across his work at the Volta Art Fair in New York City, and I was quite drawn and blown away by the beauty of the surface lyrical nature of the paintings. I know I'm getting completely off track, but it's worth saying. He's a very talented man.
Well, thank you, Stanley.
Well,
So are you going to tell us about your work? I think what we'd agreed was that it would be an improvised chat as much like normal chatting as possible. And the one planned element would be that you would tell us about your project, the IR paintings, and then I'll respond based on what I hear you say.
That's probably a good place to start.
And I'm here, by the way, it was very kind of you to mention my paintings, but I'm here in my role as an art critic. But we'll...
Understood.
Okay, but I'll have some things to say about the funny fluidity of that boundary between critic and artist.
Okay.
But you're the artist tonight, and let's hear what your explanation is.
Okay, so February of 2012, Jerry Saltz, who's a New York art critic, puts out a blurb on his Facebook page. If anybody can make me a fake Richter, I will pay $155, but do a studio visit. The chatter on Facebook was, Jerry, you cheap son of a bitch. Jerry, go to hell. Nobody can make a painting for $155. Yada, 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 so on and so forth. I looked at that and thought, I love Richter's work. I've been working with squeegees for about 25 years. I have no idea specifically how he makes his paintings. And I really don't like the idea of copying someone, so just sort of left a question mark in the back of my mind. About a month later, the documentary Gerhard Richter Painting comes out, which I saw with my jaw bouncing across the floor in amazement how a 79-year-old man was wielding a 10-foot wide squeegee, making these magnificent paintings, and how physical and interesting. And to the average person, it would have been just an interesting documentary. To me, it was, knowing what I know about working with squeegees and paint, it was essentially nearly a how-to to make a Richter, or a specific type of Richter, at least the type of work that he was making in the documentary. So I sat on the idea for another full month, again, really torn by not wanting to copy Gerhard Richter, yet the idea of getting an important New York art critic to my studio was very tantalizing. So one day, no particular reason, I thought, what the hell, I have to give it a shot. So build my first Richterian type squeegee and start, futzing paint around. First few paintings were very frustrating, but very quickly started to get some interesting results. 3 weeks in, I have something that I thought was pretty strong. So I sent it to Jerry privately on Facebook. His response, I don't believe you made that. To which I thought, that's good. So I started a dialogue between the two of us, and 2.5 months later, he's in my studio. And let me just take a little sidebar here. Before I went down that road, I was making paintings like what you might see. There's one downstairs, which look like sort of raindrops falling. Those are acrylic on silkscreen fabrics, paintings that I had pioneered and made, and I had a good gallery in California wanting to show that work. So it was really, that was another level of the, should I, diverge for these weeks or months, whatever it might be, into this other realm of the Richterian world, or stay the course. But I thought, if I'm lucky enough to get Jerry to my studio, I will immediately go back to the other work that I was making. Well, by the time I sent Jerry the piece that he got excited about, I had really started to fall in love with the process and the possibilities of what can be done through the process. So Jerry comes to my studio. He's there 2.5 hours. Says, Stanley, I'm so blown away by what you've done. I'm going to pitch my editors to do a story on you. And that was right when Eric Clapton had sold the truly magnificent Richter of his that went for, I believe it was $34 million at Sotheby's here in London. I don't know what it was in pounds, but a lot of money. And anyways, money in the art world to Jerry is a thorn in his side. He doesn't believe that any painting should ever cost more than $10,000. But Jerry's socialism is not the world we're living in. But anyways, so that's kind of how it started, but I literally fell in love with the process, and I have not looked back.
When you told me that earlier, and I couldn't help thinking of The King of Comedy, that 1970s movie, with very jolie laid actress Sandra Bernhard.
Okay.
And Robert De Niro. Anybody know that film? It's a masterpiece of weirdness by Scorsese, and it came out just after, I think it was the next one after Taxi Driver. Maybe in between was New York, New York. It's a slightly sort of failed movie by Scorsese with Liza Minnelli and Robert De Niro.
Okay.
This film came out and it was very ill-liked at the time. It was a very uncomfortable film. And Jerry, in that film, was Jerry Lewis, the comedian.
Okay.
Who played a very thinly disguised version of himself. But the side of him that is the hyper-controlling producer of the Jerry Lewis sort of movies and mythology.
Right.
And in the film, he was cast as a TV producer who ran a chat show. And Sandra Bernhard and Robert De Niro were these sort of weird, pathologically distorted fans of Jerry. And, you know, Jerry had these weird fans around. And every day he would go for a walk around the block from the TV station. He'd always watch out for the weird fans who might shoot him, you know, because as we know of that kind of fanship, there's a duality of desire and hostility. And the pathology of that kind of fanship has become more and more well known in the age of celebrity, since those things go together. And Robert De Niro was a kind of working class fan of this kind, and Sandra Bernhard was more upper class. She lived on the Upper West Side, and he lived out, actually, probably in Jersey.
Okay.
Where your great studio complex is.
Yeah, Jersey.
Yeah, and but in those days there was, you know, no thought that studios would be out there. You know?
Okay.
And but very obsessively they're trying to get hold. They want to touch Jerry. They want to have something to do with Jerry, like fans do. And we know that fans are capable of killing their subjects.
Sure.
Because it hadn't yet happened, but we know it. We know since then, you know, 5 years after that film came out, someone very like them did shoot John Lennon.
Right.
So and it's very much in our minds. You know, it's part of modern life. And I see your paintings as a weird sort of enactment in which paintings are almost, their painterliness is not so much the issue as the whole complex of, although it's not your title for the talk tonight, I think it's the gallery's title, a whole complex to do with almost a sort of, I said this to you earlier, that I thought Jerry, in a way, for you, is, at least in this scenario that you're talking about, is a sort of cartoon of power. You know, he's a fictional person in a way, sort of stands for power in a way. He's somebody who, he might come to your studio, that would be amazing, because something would really change. But on the other hand, he wanted to be an artist, but he isn't any good. You know, he's a critic instead. You know, so there's sort of desire and hostility going on there. And it's as if what's ensued, and I'm not now talking about the qualities of the work, which they have. You know, I think I'm talking about the whole scenario of what unfolds is a scenario very like that movie of some sort of pathology is played out, And in your case, the absolute compelling surrealism of it for me is that it goes out into the real world of people who are art collectors and art lovers and are interested in your work. I cannot, I've met Jerry a few times. I've been to his flat. He's a nice guy. He's obviously very egotistical. He's very articulate and observant. He has an interest in fakes. I didn't know that until you told me.
Yeah.
I don't know, and I still don't know. I don't believe you do either. Maybe Jerry doesn't know either. We don't know what the interest is, really. You described it earlier, and I was in the concept. You said, well, he likes great art, but he can't afford it. He doesn't believe he should pay those prices.
Right.
And I immediately wanted to resist that because I don't know what the word great means in this context. And I think maybe he wants fakes as some kind of. He wants to cut the power world down to size a bit. He's become a power figure, but he wasn't always one. You mentioned his socialism. Maybe he's doing certain levelings by collecting a lot of fakes.
When money enters into the conversation with Jerry, he doesn't understand the simple laws of supply and demand in the art world or in the world in general. And that's the only reason, a Richter that sells for $34 million, it's supply and demand. It's literally the market forces of supply and demand. But that's something people have to realize is that that's a two-way street. That painting that sold for $34 million may resell for 20. It may resell for 50. It may,
but Jerry wasn't saying, is there an oligarch out there with so many Richters that for a laugh they would sell me a real one for $155?
Right.
He was saying, if you could paint a fake that would fool me, I would pay $155. And you did. And
yes.
He gave you $155
Yes.
and he went home with a painting. He was happy with it. And in fact, he was so happy he made promises he couldn't actually keep about having a story in that.
And then, he had this sort of dream that he wanted to sell my work, which thank goodness.
In The King of Comedy, what happens is that a lot of the film becomes more and more embarrassing. It's very, very difficult to watch. That's why people didn't like it at the time. And it's had an afterlife, as some of those weird films do, that are difficult at the time. Now it's considered one of his greatest films. But what happens as the plot unfolds is that the two fanatic fans kidnap Jerry, and they take him to the Upper West Side flat, and they wrap him up in a load of tapes. It's all taped up like that. And Sandra Bernhardt there kind of torments him with her madness. She says, I love you, we're going to make love on this table, and I'm just going to rip my clothes off. And she's having all this monologue, which it's her fantasies about him. Right. But he's taped and gagged. He can't talk. He's tied up.
Right.
And they have phoned the TV company, and they say, Jerry's going to get killed with this gun, but it's a fake gun, but nobody knows.
Okay.
Unless Robert De Niro, who plays Rupert Pupkin, this sort of loser guy, lives in a basement in his mother's flat, surrounded by photos of Jerry. Unless Rupert Pupkin is allowed on Jerry's chat show to do his comedy monologue, Jerry gets it. And they think, well, okay, we'll tell him that we will. The police are there and everything, and it gets bigger and bigger. And these absurd characters actually cause this event to happen. And the absurd denouement is that Rupert Pupkin does give his comedy monologue. And it's a weird sort of thing. You don't know if that's good or bad, And at some point, Sandra's so carried away, I can't remember what her fictional name is. She rips off the gag, rips off all his tape, and she thinks love is going to happen.
Right.
And he just sucks her in the jaw. He's so angry and furiously stalks out. And she's almost like pleased she even got hit. The whole thing is, you don't know what, afterwards you're thinking, well, what was the higher value of the film? What was the moral? What was it telling us about? Since the only thing you come away with, overwhelmingly, defeating all other ideas, is celebrity. And celebrity isn't a value. It's a morbid symptom of a confusion about values that we more and more are subject to. We don't, Eric Clapton, like the way that surprisingly footballers are often quite knowledgeable about wine and food, simply because they're so wealthy.
Right.
They get to eat very, very fine food, very fine wine. So after a few years of that, they are actually gourmets. Eric Clapton may well have a very, very sensitive eye for Richter, But I doubt if he'd had, done a lot of reading of any of the critics behind me. So he would have probably a sensitive radar for the look of a Richter, the texture of it. He would be able to tell that yours are not Richters in real life. Maybe not in reproduction. That they do have a quality of deceiving in reproduction. But I suppose what I'm looking for is I'm hearing a very, very compelling, to me, surreal drama that you're telling me about. It's almost like a dream.
It is.
And I'm looking for the moral in your story. I'm looking at the strange morality of the Scorsese film, which was a prophetic film, really. It didn't seem to have a moral at the time. And it's since come to have a moral about the morbid nature of celebrity. And then I'm looking at the issue of the art world now and why people buy things. We know sociologically that oligarchs buy Richter because they know Eric Clapton does. Not because they have the remotest interest in Richter. How could they? It's obscure artist.
That goes down all the way the food chain to somebody spending $2,000 on a painting by an unknown because their friend, when the Joneses have it, then I want it.
Yeah, well, I'm not complaining about it. I'm just saying that we know it very well.
Yeah, that's...
and we also know that art plays... I don't know whether we know it, but we could intuit that art plays a weird role at the moment in relation to the rest of society. In that because there is now a much wider audience for it than there ever was, this art cannot function and it cannot be promoted and discussed and bought unless there's some kind of narrative that a very wide audience can get. So that narrative has to be extremely simplified in the main messages. There can be any number of obscure art critical ideas, which none of us would take seriously. But the main message is that, this art distinguishes you socially, it sets you aside from everybody else, it's more unique than the most expensive yachts, or at least it's on a level with yachts.
Right.
So there's a reason to acquire it. We know that there's a financial market which produces wealth, which can mop up these objects, and there's a sort of a cycle of production and buying.
And creates the hysteria for the objects.
Yes, and
wealth
around that core of Eric Clapton level of wealth and buying, which is a sort of vortex of finances and art objects. There's a spin-off, like a Catherine wheel, in which your work is made and my work is made and the majority of work is made. Right. And we all financially benefit from that whirring Catherine wheel. While at the same time, we morally do the opposite of benefiting, since we live in this intellectually grotesque world of fake sort of promotion of dubious objects. And it's up to Richter and Stanley and Matthew and Liz Payton or whoever we can think of. They've got to make their own integrity, because the whole thing has no integrity. Art is like the most horrible thing you could possibly imagine. It's the least desirable thing. But the individual objects and the individual artists, they've got to make their own culture, and they've got to change that Catherine wheel that has hell at its center into some kind of redeeming social process instead of the sign of society's corruption that it actually is.
And maybe it's a sign of society's corruption that you can't get rid of that. For me, it always boils back to the actual work, the painting at hand. What I'm making right now, is it magnificent on some level? Is it making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up? Is it changing my consciousness, my mindset for these moments? Is it powerful? Is it dynamic? Is it beautiful? Is it sumptuous? And if it is, then it's something that I'd like to let out into the world. And whatever economic value it gets, yes, I hope to sell work because I can't make it unless I sell it. Will my work ever sell for astronomical prices? Probably not.
But it sounds as though you've had some success, though. People have been buying.
Absolutely, I've had
part
success,
of the
and it's
strangeness of the
wonderful.
story.
I mean, I'm almost embarrassed to say how many paintings I sold last year. It's incredible. It's unbelievable, and it only adds fuel to the fire under my ass to make better and better work, because that's what it's about. Boil down this experience called life. 13.5 billion years of evolution, galactic evolution, the evolution of our solar system and the planet, and from single-cell life to what we have right now. This thing is a gift, in my mind.
Which
life,
thing?
right? A gift. Life. Right now, this moment, it's a gift. Not a miracle, but a gift. So how can I celebrate the fact that I'm here? And I choose to paint and to try and make the most, again, magnificent paintings I can conceivably possibly make. And I paint for me, not for anyone else, but I'm a damn good judge of what's good, what's mediocre, and what's fabulous, and occasionally what's really magnificent. And that's what I can control. And that's my approach to it. Getting the jump start in my career from Jerry Saltz, which, by the way, I would never have made an Inhaling Richter painting if it were not for the Saltz Challenge. So that's a weird bit of irony. I would never have gone down that road because I would never want to have copied Richter. I've never copied anybody.
Well, it sounds as though it was a very fortuitous...
I did it completely to get him, if I was lucky enough to get him into my studio, because maybe he could pick up the phone and call David Zwerner. That's why I went down the road. I did not anticipate falling in love with the process.
Well, I mean, it sounds like it was a very fortuitous turn of events for you in terms of your confidence about making your work and commercial success, and nothing helps developing one's own culture of art more than response, a positive response from an audience. One
Absolutely.
doesn't expect the audience necessarily to have intellectually covered all the ground or to understand why they like it. They just like it. That's good.
Right.
They show their appreciation by paying for it, and it encourages you. But my little list here of art critics that I like. These are people who, I think that film was a magnificent film, dark and puzzling as its message was, and I urge everyone to illegally download it straight away on whatever methods you have. But my visual essay here of the art critics that I like is really is a sort of antidote to the darkness of that film, in that I'm trying to get ideas onto a normal level so that an art critic cannot be a god or a devil, and there is no real, obviously there's a categorical imperative for the table to be a table and not a glass.
Right.
So it's useful that critics are critics and artists are artists.
Sure.
But the fact is that very often critics have been artists. They tumble into art somehow. It turns out that for one reason or another they hone some kind of sensibility they have in the realm of articulating and writing more than in the realm of making. And then they tend to give up the making and go on to the thing. But I've selected these people going back 2 or 3 centuries. And the first ones I put up were ones that I knew had a history of making art. And in fact, are known more as artists, like in the case of Donald Judd or Art and Language, say. But the art critic Clement Greenberg, who's a very famous art critic who championed Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism in the 50s, was initially thought that he would be a painter and thought he would be an artist and was a rather good drawer, and he even kept up a bit of painting secretly all through his life. So he is surprisingly a painter as well as an intellectualizer of the process of painting. And Art and Language is sort of fearsome. I'm not going to bother to synchronize what I'm saying with their pictures. You've seen them going by, so you can you can make the edit yourself, the mental edit that fit it with the picture. Art and Language are a conceptual art group from the late 60s who originated in England and then had members in America and then in Australia, and it was a sort of global group of terrifyingly intellectual artists who reduced art to the letter A typed on a piece of paper, or index cases full of references to science or something. And that sort of imploded after a few years. They all fell out with each other, and the Australians hated the Americans hated the English.
Right.
Joseph Kasuth was one of them, the conceptual artist. And now there's only two. The original founder, Michael Baldwin, is this rather nice-looking old man with white hair, is in one of the pictures with another guy, Mel Ramsden. Mel Ramsden was a guy who mostly lived in England, but he was actually born Australian. Now the two of them, they live with their families in Oxfordshire in a little sort of socialist row of houses where they bring up their kids, and they're trying to sort of change art culture so it's more socialist, and eventually change the world so it's more socialist. But they do it via conceptual art, so it's a bit of a long shot, as you say, in the nowadays art world. And then I've got Diderot up there, who's the Salon, the Art Critic. If any of you would like to study art history and who were the first art critics and art writers, the cliche first one is Vasari from the period of the Renaissance. And then in terms of our modern art lingo, art critical lingo, usually we say that Diderot is the beginner. He sort of put together the bits of language which would evolve into the critical language that we now have. That at its most refined and difficult extreme is people like Rosalind Krauss and Hal Foster and Benjamin Buchloh, who I've got up here, connected with October magazine. And at its most chatty version is Jerry Saltz. But it involves certain things that didn't really exist before Diderot, which is you go to the show, there is a show, which maybe there wouldn't have been before then, you describe, you evaluate, and you find a sort of set of terms to make sense of your experience. So in the case of Diderot, he very little talks about the things that Clement Greenberg would talk about. He doesn't say, well, I saw a lovely painting by a Rococo painter, and it had orange and purple and some squiggly marks, and the edges were very nicely dealt with. He doesn't say that. He says, well, there was a scene of a beautiful girl and a man coming in from the side, and perhaps there was an atmosphere between them, and they were in a beautiful room with some chairs, and the light came in from the window, and it struck the side of the beautiful maiden's face in such a way. And I thought, and then he would reflect on it, and he would be rather acidic and witty and French in the 18th century way. But description, evaluation, what I thought, interpretation, things like that start arriving. Things that now come naturally to us, I guess at a very debased level, they're the language of press releases. And at an intelligent but not very formalized level, it's Jerry Saltz. And at the super intelligent, very intellectual and very formalized level, it's October Journal. So Diderot is really the originator of those things. And Apollinaire, who pops up there, he's the guy who thought up the word cubism to describe the cubists. He thought up the word surrealists in advance of André Breton thinking it up. And he thought up the word orphism, which describes the works of Delaunay. So he was good at coming up with jargon labels. And he was a poet, and he thought of a lot of sort of poetic meanings that cubism might have that are, in a way, are put into words some of the instinctual contents that the artists had. So they loved him, they went around with him. And he, using, to some extent, the basis of critical language that Diderot had developed, he adapted it to the moment, to the early 1910s moment, or pre-1910s moment of Cubism. And he came up with something more approaching the kind of language that Clement Greenberg would use in the 1950s. So I suppose the people that I put up there are people who I think are stops along a line, not necessarily a progression, but I guess to some extent it starts at a certain point and then it comes to be the critical language of the last 50 years. And and then I've got up a Russian guy who's part of a movement in Russia in the 1910s and 20s called formalism, which that word has come to have a very different meaning since then. Those guys thought very abstractly about the world and about art, and but they deconstructed things and they broke it down to the component parts. But as the quote says that I've got up there from Victor Shklovsky, who's a formalist who died only recently, actually, he survived right through the 20th century, but in the 20s he was about 20. He said that what abstraction does, at that time abstraction was the thing. Everyone was scratching their heads thinking, well, how will abstraction serve the building of this new socialist society, no longer a feudal aristocratic czarist society, a socialist society. How will abstraction do it? He said, well, what abstraction does is that it breaks art down into graspable meanings. It takes away sort of level of artifice so that we are put more in touch with life. We feel the stoniness of the stone rather than thinking of stone as a sign. Art sort of refreshes or estranges what was familiar in a positive way, so that we see life in some kind of refreshed way. But all of these people, as I describe them, they seem to stand for quite sort of esoteric notions. But what I find attractive about them is the opposite, the plainness of what they're trying to do, that they're looking at something which has the possibility of being a mere sort of morbid symptom, where an art critic is a power guy, an artist is a genius guy, and those are signs played out in a sort of dream of illness. They're trying to break all that down and find realistic ideas to substitute for that unrealistic world, the unrealistic world in which Sandra... Is she Sarah or Sandra? Sandra's the famous actress in the 19th century, and Sarah's the beautiful comedian, right? With the big lips. She looks a bit like Tracy Emin.
Yes.
She's Sarah or Sandra?
Sarah.
Who knows?
Sarah Silverman.
What?
Sarah Silverman?
No. That's now. That's very now.
Sarah.
Sarah Bernhardt.
Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah. She looks like a goofy, beautiful duck. Yeah. Her and Robert De Niro, they kidnap that guy. They tie him up. They're crazy fantasies for which they should be in therapy. In fact, she has, because she's wealthy. She's been in therapy for years, but it doesn't work. So they're so lost. I think these critics, in their way, they're trying to break that down and get to some kind of meaning that art might have. And not in order to have power over art. If anything, to get rid of false power. I guess they want to have power over a mystery. They want to solve a mystery, but they, as far as I can see, and what I like about them, what I would identify them in, they accept that there is some mystery, of course. Like there's a mystery to the beauty of the light in the world.
But what about the unintended consequence of the power of a critic in terms of his or her influence on the market?
Yes.
For the particular.
Well, it depends if you've got a society that's deeply ill or not.
Well, and ours is deeply ill. And I can tell you my own story.
I'm just going to. I want to hear your story a bit more.
Sure.
Of your story. I just want to ask you this question. It's great that you sold your work, but what do you think money is? Money is a tool which enables various things to happen. So we don't have to. I don't have to bring all the possessions of my house and say, could I possibly exchange this for, a very nice Gucci handbag, or I can get out my credit card and say, I like that Gucci handbag. We both know this card will somehow get digitally or algorithmically to a source of funds which bears some kind of relationship to all the possessions of my house and some properties I have, and things that are of value, and I'm going to exchange somehow through this magic card, through the thing called money. I'm going to draw on some of the value of those accumulated items, and you'll give me that Gucci handbag. And they say yes. And in the morbid society that we have, something very black and dark happened with a bit of plastic and its relationship to the objects and to all our relationships with each other, so that wealth is very profoundly abstracted and is the repository of very profoundly sick dreams and sick fantasies, rather than money being a tool of convenience to make society work better.
But I would argue...
And in that world, that's when the critics assume that morbid... You said the unintended side effects of... they might have a certain useful power in their gift of articulacy. And then an unintended side effect is they become these sort of demons of power. And I would say it's not so much... I would say one can see how that happens in a world ruled by fear and inequality and injustice. You're talking about an injustice, art critics are a little demigods.
But it's both ways. It's both an injustice, and it can be perfectly accurate. If I read a review that I agree with, I think, bravo, I agree with it. If I read a review that I entirely disagree with, I think, but again, it's information. But I think part of the topic at hand is the influence of a critic towards markets. And again, my own story is Jerry Saltz suddenly put me on the map with a 4-page article in New York Magazine. A lot of people that didn't know me suddenly knew me and went, what's that? And because of the stroke of credibility from Jerry Saltz, a lot of people bought work. And it helped to build other relationships with other galleries. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Ultimately, my work has to be, I would argue, not just good, but has to be bordering on great. Because I'm working in the shadow of Gerhard Richter, so I had better define myself away from Richter, and the work had better be magnificent. And if it is, on some level, in general, then there's really the potential that it becomes its own thing. But again, the beginning of that creation was, in this case, Jerry Saltz, and this quirky thing of me taking up a challenge. But if I didn't, let me just say this, maybe I did a bit before, but if I didn't truly fall in love with the process, I'm not making these paintings because they sell. I'm making these paintings because I love making these paintings. And I wouldn't be able to make gems of paintings if my head weren't completely in it, if I wasn't going to bed at night thinking about it, dreaming about it, waking up thinking about it. I can't tell you the number of times my wife sends me to the grocery store to get 3 things, and I come back with either 2 or 4, and half or all are right or wrong.
You could do some cognitive therapy for that.
I need to put more notes in my phone. My head is about painting, but it fascinates me. It engulfs me. I love it. But again, the power of a critic to influence. A gentleman who bought a large piece from me early on, who read the Saltz article, he's somebody who's a big time collector. Spends hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars every year buying contemporary art. That's a perfect example. He's a speculator. He'll be flipping the paintings that he's bought from me. I don't know when, but that's how he rolls. But specifically, it's like he goes to the Whitney Biennial, and he'll end up buying, work from, 20% of the artists in that show. Specifically, and it's going to sit in storage. And that's I don't like that side of the art world. I wish, as much as the opposite side is where somebody buys it because it matches the sofa, but that's okay too. I would rather the work be enjoyed and loved. But unfortunately, once it's done, it becomes a commodity, and then it's going to do whatever it's going to do.
I think it's a funny sort of, in the case of your story, the power of Jerry is a it's the absolute sort of Bugs Bunny side of Jerry. It's not about his observations. It's about his willingness to not observe.
And the article
he wants to see a fake.
The article was as much about Jerry, if not more so, than it was about me. It was about Jerry and his fakes. I read that article as quasi-condescending towards me and my work. I've had other people tell me that's
But
not
he
how
wrote
they
the article
read it.
before he knew you, right?
No, he came to my studio and then wrote the article.
Then he did write the article.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
yeah,
misunderstood
yeah.
you.
He was in my studio in...
He wrote an article for New York Magazine.
Yes.
About you.
Yes.
Well, that's tremendous.
It's called How to Fake a Richter.
Right. But it was a little bit disappointing because it was more about him than you.
Well, yeah, and he told me, he said, you might become a novelty out of this. And I said, Jerry, I don't give a shit. I got, very little going on right now. I'll take any press I can get. And again, if my shtick was copying Richter, we wouldn't be having this conversation. My paintings wouldn't be in this gallery. They'd be 2-bit paintings that you could sell all day long for $5,000 a piece, but that doesn't interest me. I'm not interested in what I know or what humanity knows. I'm interested in what hasn't been discovered. I'm interested in making paintings that forge new ground.
It's a very curious story. I think we should let it involves publicity and celebrity and a very sort of curiously hard to pin down set of values. And I appreciate that you are very clear about your own values, that art for you must be great, it must be you're trying to get to the magnificent, and you love it, and those are the words you use to describe your intensity, I suppose, as opposed to these other nebulous factors that also make up the story.
Sure.
And of course, the thing about the Scorsese film is that the film, as a work of art, was magnificent. It was a slow-burning thing. Now it's like one of his best things. It's certainly and the magnificence of it is that it is so strangely surprising all the way through. But I'm just summing up now. I'm summarizing what we've been saying so that you can ask your questions, which no doubt you're burning to ask. But I just wanted to summarize my take of distance. And I really, wish you luck, and I think it's great, and I'm sure that Jerry would as well. But I keep thinking of Jerry as Jerry in this film. I can't think of him as a real person, even though I've met him many times, actually. And I wish the gallery luck, and I wish the collectors luck who bought your stuff, and I'm sure you'll go somewhere with what you're doing. But for me, I feel very outside of it, as I think about, Richter himself, this boring guy who we ridiculously revere. Nobody knows why. Up there, the main Richter critic is pictured up there, Benjamin Buchloh, the main supporter, who's done the best interviews with Richter, explained Richter the best, in a very, very dazzlingly convincing way. There's a very dazzlingly fascinating dialogue between them, which you can access if you just Google Richter Buchloh, Benjamin Buchloh. They talk about Richter's relationship with those works, in particular the sort of squeegee works, which their origin is something like the early 80s. Where he first started doing large-scale, brightly coloured abstracts, which involved a certain squeegee element. And then later on, they've got more and more to do with that kind of mark making, the one that you're imitating. They talk about that work's relationship to the entirety of his work, and the entirety of his work relationship to three main factors, I would say. Photography is already puzzling. We think, well, why squeegee is an abstraction in relation to photography? Because we know that one day he's squeegeeing, the next day he's copying photos. So we know that the body of work integrates all those elements, and that the other factor, besides photography, reality, what is photography's relationship to reality? And then there's a third factor, art. What is art's relationship to reality and photography? We know that those squeegee paintings, they play a role for him in some kind of rather flat philosophy that he has. Where there's an excitement about Richter's work, it's occasionally a sort of dogged, he sees a process through, and every now and again one is slightly less boring than the others. On the whole, we're quite clear we're not looking at Picasso. Or we all know we're involved in a weird sort of clapping for Tinkerbell so that Tinkerbell doesn't die in Peter Pan. And every now and again there's a mildly good one. But we're conditioned socially that we do not commit suicide professionally, like I'm doing now, to say what we all know to be true. That this is visually boring art. But every now and then, one accidentally comes out quite good. But and that's because the premise of the work is not visual. It's other things. The sort of bleak, staged minimalism that he's about. And on that level, it's very, very successful. It's much more related to Bruce Nauman in the early 70s than it is to the tradition of large-scale, colour-rich, texture-rich painting that he ironically refers to with his Screedy thing. The reference is there, but the actual re-instanting of sensual impact that Tiepolo has, or that Rothko has, or Pollock has, obviously isn't there, and he doesn't even claim that it is there. It's quite clear that it isn't there.
I would disagree with you on that.
Well, that's fine. It's clear that you do. All I'm doing is I'm just summarising my distance from all concepts to do with great and magnificent, which to me are sort of laughable and almost grotesque, really. But because of the context, because of the wider context of a valueless and art world that we inhabit, the only shared values are extremely morbid, to do with social climbing, avariciousness, power, fear of not being seen, fear of lack of success, and the perverted positives of being seen and being successful and wealth being a measure of success. So I can never use the language of great or magnificent unless it's about something that so much time has passed that we're not really engaged in this social moment's values. So here I'm sort of explaining my distance from the project at the same time as I'm absolutely congratulating you on your undoubted success.
Well, thank you.
In your project. And I wonder what the audience who have had a very different life experience to me, since absolutely none of them, even though some of them must be quite close to my age, none of them have heard of this film. Where the hell have you all been? But anyway, so what have you got to say now in response to our lively chat?
Question, is this working all right? Stanley, it's
yes.
you. I'm going to ask you a question, but before that, I just want to say I've been completely blown away by your art, actually. I think it's really fantastic. And any sort of sense that it's a copy to Gerhard Richter is ridiculous. It's unique, I think, in its own right, just using a technique which is similar. And I've come in quite a few times to see the show and brought friends.
Oh, thank you.
They're entering into our dreams, actually, which I think, is really strong. We're talking about
incredibly touching.
Our dreams, and one of the guys, has been really affected by it and his work. So I just wanted to say that. But it just seemed we have an amazing opportunity to hear you talk about one of your pieces, perhaps. I mean, it just seems to me you're a very direct person. You talk from your experience, which sounds great to me. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about this painting. Is that all right?
Of course. And that piece, ironically, is from very early on. That is IR 17. And that's a deceptive number because the way I work today, for instance, a lot of the paintings downstairs are IR 44-3, 9, 17, whatever. And I think the 44 designation may go all the way to 33. But that was back when each painting had its own designation until I looked. And I started titling paintings that way, literally looking at how Richter titled his pieces. But the reason I chose to title the work IR, Inhaling Richter, was to pay direct homage to Gerhard Richter. That's where it came from. Let's not beat around the bush. I copied his tool. As Picasso said, good artists copy, great artists steal. I stole his tool, but I modified his tool. I put wheels on the side of the squeegee so that when you see lines that are basically running down or sideways, that's because I have a wall perpendicular to the wall that I paint on. So if I want to keep straight lines, I can keep straight lines. If I want to have jiggly lines, I can make jiggly lines. But the process to make a work, I was telling Mila downstairs, somewhere between 1 out of 5 and 1 out of 10 times a painting goes according to plan. Now, throughout this, like when that painting was made, most of what was happening for the first time. That is, I didn't have empirical evidence to go on. Now, having made literally hundreds, many thrown away, but literally made in the course of 2 years, hundreds of these paintings, I have a set of empirical evidence such that if I know I do A, B, and C, I'm going to get some degree of D. It might be DE. But that's also what I love about the process, is diving into the unknown, trying new things. I will often challenge myself in the middle of a painting, what's the contrarian thing to do? What is the opposite of what would make sense here? And that cuts both ways. That turns into a whole new body of work, and it might kill the painting in hand. But the beauty of this process is, for however much paint you see on a painting, and it varies, somewhere between that amount of paint to 5 times that amount of paint got scraped off. Much of the beauty of what happens is in the removal of paint. The squeegee, which I really prefer to call a palette knife, because that's really what it is a tool that you can both add paint with and remove paint with, and do it seamlessly in the course of passing the squeegee over the surface. I tend to always start at one edge and go to the other edge with a squeegee that's as wide as the entire surface. If you Google this Gerhard Richter film, Gerhard Richter painting, you will see that he will use squeegees as wide as the surface, as well as smaller squeegees, as well as he will dig in with knives. And the way, there soon is going to be a little documentary on me coming out, made by the place where my studio is located in New Jersey, called Modifying Arts, which is an interview and an expose of me making a piece. Richter and I bake the cake very differently. The first paintings, I emulated exactly how he baked the cake. And very quickly, by the time of this painting, my personality is coming out. And what I feel, or color choices, this and that, but the process of using a squeegee, which in the case of that painting, the squeegee is, if that's 213 centimeters wide, the squeegee is 240 centimeters wide, give or take. You can get fascinating results with squeegee pass number 1. Different colors on the squeegee. It's the physics of paint mixing, as though you took a brush this wide and you put green and pink and black, and you took it to the wall and you went shh until it ran out of paint. You would first have defined green, pink, and black. You'd have a mixing of green, pink, and black, and you'd eventually have mud of green, pink, and black. This is just the same. I'm just using a huge paintbrush. It happens to be a piece of plastic. But the course of making a painting, I start out with an idea and with a concept of colors, forms, but from the very first marks, the painting takes on its own life. And I guess maybe the best way to describe it is an action-reaction process. I make an action, I stand back, I look, I react to that. So I constantly readjust what it might need in order to get where I want it to go. But sometimes, for instance, if I think it's going to take 15 passes of the squeegee, at pass number 5, it's unexpectedly magnificent. And I've had that happen where I'm like, I can't touch this. But that also cuts both ways, where I've stopped, and then the next day I'm like, should have kept going. And depending upon how much surface is there, I may go back and work on a painting. More often than not today, I don't, because I'm very concerned about purity of the surface. And when you work over a previously established surface, that surface comes through whatever you put on top of it. And right now I'm increasingly conflicted by that. So, but that's kind of a nutshell. And a big difference between Richter and I. Richter, when he starts a painting, it goes on the wall like this, and he goes side to side this way, up, down. I turn the painting nearly each and every time the squeegee goes across it. And one of the magical things about that, and it's not just for my work, but any object, you take an object and you turn it sideways, all the relationships within that change. Turn it sideways again, all the relationships change. So I'm seeing a new painting each and every time I turn it. Not to mention that when the squeegee goes over the surface, whatever it touches changes. So again, if that painting there, if it had an area that I wasn't, oh, I better not walk away. If it had an area I wasn't happy with, I would have had no choice but to then continue working on the whole thing. You wouldn't see that as it exists at all. When I was at that point, it was either a bravo moment or keep going. You know, and again, that it cuts both ways, where I stop too soon and I kill things that are arguably good. But I don't care, and I don't care when I lose a painting. I don't care when I throw away a painting. It's all part of the process to get to those nirvana moments where something is magnificent. And I'll just throw it in here, but I have this sort of arbitrary scale that I use to grade paintings. That and for any painting ever made, it's somewhere between 1 and 100. Nobody's ever made 100. In my opinion, I've never made a 98. I've made a few 97s in my life. Richter has made a few 98s. Rothko has made 199. But if a painting is not an 87 or better, then it's not good enough.
What's this one?
That's certainly a 90. There's one downstairs that I would say is a 95. This one around the corner, maybe 93. And believe me, those are the exception. It may take 20 paintings to get one that's that good. But the other criteria I do, which is even more powerful, is I call it my Larry Gagosian test. If Larry Gagosian walked into my studio at this moment, would I show it to him? And if the answer is no, it's not only not good enough to show to Larry Gagosian, it's not good enough to give away. But that could be Mila, that could be Matthew. The issue at hand is somebody important. Would I share this painting? And if the answer is no, then it's not good enough. So that's my general approach.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated that.
Thank you for the question.
Hi, this is to Matthew. You talked a lot about how art critics, or at least some of them, have sort of been artists before, and I couldn't help but think of the art critics that we have now, and how, well, at least the ones that I'm being taught by, they didn't have any sort of real background in art history at all. They did things like history and like economics or whatever. And now that I'm studying at the Courtauld and I'm an art critic, but I'm surrounded by like a new generation of young people who are now being taught to be critical. And there's a course at the Royal College of Art which is about becoming an art critic. It's like critical thinking in art and design. And so I can't help but wonder how the climate of art criticism is going to be when it is all people my age, where we've all been taught to be critics, whereas other critics haven't been taught to be critics. What's that actually going to do about, like, how that's actually going to change how we say things, or how everything's going to pan out in terms of like organic response or organic judgments, like, because we've all been sort of dictated how to think.
Is your question about whether art critics are taught to be critics or if they had any experience of being artists.
Well, what I mean is that if you're an art critic, and regardless of if you're an artist or not, you're passing judgment on an art piece. But when you've had formal training of being an art critic, then how can you judge something objectively or at all?
Okay, well, it's a very good question. And the people that are going by on this slideshow come from a period of 200 years or so, almost 300 years. And across that time, there were, and in the European, mostly, almost entirely, centres in which they worked, there was a changing set of conditions of life. Life and society was subject to changing conditions from 1763 to 1917 to 1950 to 2009. And in each of those, along that spectrum, something different was expected of what art critic meant, the same as something different was expected for what art meant. So it's not an accident that in the 50s and 60s and 70s, many people who practiced as art critics had a previous background as artists. They had a background in making. They had some familiarity with the sort of pragmatic, empirical experience that Stanley is talking about, the actual making of things. Because in those days, the cultural expectation of art was that it had something to do with making. And in our time, that is less so. And it's not necessarily a terrible thing, or it's not necessarily a bad thing. It so happens that there was a period when the improvising and making and thinking about materials and seeing a lot of significance in the action and movement of materials was dominant, really, in all judgments about art. And with the passing of that phase of expectations about art, and those expectations themselves answered something in the air of society, probably. It was a more making society, one could say. It's a production society with factories making things. People went to work and made things. With the passing of that way of life comes a new type of culture with new priorities and new ways of judging that go with those priorities. So we have something called contemporary art now, which is the first time really that none of the isms really mean anything. The thing that unites everything is contemporary art, and anything could happen in that contemporary art. It could be Stanley's art, it could be Richter's art, it could be performance art, photography, it could be anything. And it's not a requirement of expertise in contemporary art that you should have any interest in the pragmatic making process of things, because a lot of that art itself has little interest in that. The fact that Stanley does have an interest in it, and that many artists do, doesn't alter the overall picture that art could be intensely made, but it needn't be. And the very fact that it needn't be means that comment on it doesn't have to be tuned into making. So the part of your question, the part of what I heard your question, where you were connecting art critics who had also been artists, I'm sort of addressing that in what I just said, that all you have to do something else now. You have to develop a sort of commenting expertise in being able to comment more on some sense of art's connection to life as it is now. It's a more sociological enterprise, inflected by art, but it's broadly sociological. Whereas before it was more you had a sort of sensitive radar for how something was made and the vigour of the making and the sensitivity of the surface of the painting or the way the materials have been used in the sculpture. The broadening out of all the various ways in which art can be made and the broadening out of criteria by which art is judged means that you don't have to have that sensitivity anymore. And if you did, it would be rather odd if that's all you ever talked about, because there'd be so much art that wouldn't really fit with what you were saying. But as to a more sort of a weirder element of your question was to do with whether critics ought to be trained to be critics. That's an interesting question, very interesting question, because, of course, none of these people were trained to be critics as such, but all the people who write for October Journal, which is a very sort of, I'm sure you, being at the Courtauld, you'll know what it is. It's the absolute brainiac people write for October. But they are art historians as opposed to critics. They're trained in art history, but it happens to be modern art, and they apply their training in modern art to what goes on in contemporary art. And they're not exactly trained to be critics, they're trained to be historians. And they apply historian-type knowledge to what goes on now. And in October, they don't necessarily, although implicitly they do, explicitly, they don't have reviews in October. And they don't say, well, we all went to the Richter show and we thought it wasn't as good as the last one. Or we went to the Richter show and we see some great new things, he's really gone ahead, that's very good. They more talk about an enormous picture of the world and what Richter's doing in relation to that world, and politics and society and history and sociology. And it's up to the other art magazines that are more like lifestyle magazines, a mixture of art and lifestyle, which is like Art Forum and Art Review and Frieze magazine. They do reviews, and they give something like scores. You know, they say, yes, that show is very good, but this show wasn't so good. And they're much more about fashion. You know, they have to keep up with fashion. They have to sort of keep an eye out for what everybody else is saying and pretend that they thought of it themselves. And they can't be too original because then none of the readers will understand what they're saying. They can't be too copyist because then the readers would see which magazine they're copying and buy that one instead. And it's a sort of game they all play. Now, those people, some of them did curating courses, some of them did art history courses, some of them fell, they're just hustlers from the art world. They went to art school and they fell into criticizing instead of painting. That was pretty much my history, really. And they're a mixture of people, and they're not really, they are more like critics than art historians, but they're not trained to be critics. They train themselves on the job, and their training is simply by experience. You try something, it gets edited out, you try something else, it doesn't get edited out, so you do more of that. And you probably don't ask yourself too much, why was that thing I wrote okay and the other thing not? Was it the grammar? Was it an inelegant sentence? Or was it a more appropriate thought to the house style of that magazine? That's probably as far as the thinking goes. You just think, yes, it probably was, I'll do that. You know, if I write for another magazine, I'll write a bit differently in that way. You tend not to ask yourself the meta questions, you know, like, well, who's that magazine answering to? Who are the publishers? What do they want? You know, what role does that magazine play in society? So that you would know then why you speak the critical language that you speak. All of us don't necessarily question how we communicate that much. We simply do it. You know, we communicate by convenience, for the aim of convenience. We want to get a meaning across. We're not necessarily in the business of questioning why we do it. But you asked a question which was a question of... your question seemed to be about 2 or 3 different things. It was a bit, should art critics have been artists, or should art critics be trained as critics, or how can they make judgments on something if they haven't been trained to be critics? So I'm not sure if I've answered all of them, or any of them, but I hope I've given some sense of the changeability of what it means to be a critic. That what made sense in 1967 doesn't make sense in 2014.
What do you think about the sort of difference in goals in art criticism? For example, if you look in like popular journalism and like newspapers, it's more about sort of attracting the wider audience or the general public, or trying to break things down so they can understand. Often it's just dumbing it down, but that's what they're trying to do. But then you see like more, the art criticism in October or Burlington or that type of thing. Are they two separate types of art critic, or are the art critics that are working for popular journalism, are they really just art journalists?
Yes, they are two separate types of thing. One is academic and one is a sort of consumer lifestyle journalism inflected by knowledge of art.
But is there any higher merit in either one? Or
yes,
which
there's
one?
higher merit in academic. Yes, absolutely. I mean...
But in sort of like a
dumbing down is there's no way you can say that there is no standard of values that says dumbing down is a good thing. And since that's what goes on in newspaper journalism about art, we have to say that academic criticism is ethically and morally better even though it might be a bit boring.
If you think about contemporary art right now, though, and how it's pretty much driven by the market, then how much merit can be sort of taken by academic art criticism when it really doesn't matter because it's going to be sold
Well, it's
that much at all.
certainly a testament to the powerlessness
Yeah.
of
So there is no
academia
power.
at the moment has no power at all. That's right. But they're always sort of, broadly, critics don't really have any power at the moment. Collectors have the power. And a little while ago, galleries had the power, and a little while before that, museums had the power. But really, I think anyone, I don't know if you've noticed this, Stanley, but I think anyone at any level in the art world notices that absolutely every aspect of the structure of art follows the lead of wealth.
Yes.
And although the collectors feel that they're checking what everybody else is doing, whatever is whirring in their cogs mentally is actually what drives everything else. So the big blockbuster shows are trying to follow a sort of general agenda of consumption rather than I'm not quite sure what the opposite of that would be really.
No, it's the reality of the marketplace. It's the pot calling the kettle black. It's the people on the acquisition committee for MoMA that are influencing what gets shown in the museum, not only what the museum is buying, but what gets shown in the museum. The art market and the taste created in the market, ultimately what my children's children are going to see at the Tate Modern and the Museum of Modern Art and at the Whitney and so on and so forth, are going to be what individuals, what tastemakers at the time chose to be a part of that. And I hate to say it, but a lot of that is insider trading. That's just the reality of the world that we live in. It's people, but it's a few people making decisions. And I can tell you, just to be frank and honest, I'm trying to play that game. I'm trying to get into bed with folks that.
Well, we all are, because we all live lives that are very alienated.
And not that it's about money for me, but I would love to be able to bring my daughter to MoMA and have her walk in and say, "Daddy's painting."
It's true, actually, that one should have a moral sense of the world, but that doesn't mean that you don't lead at the same time a life based on moral compromise. It's sort of impossible. The same as much of existence is trivia. We can't exist without it. So at the moment, I suppose what I was trying to say with Richter, I was exaggerating in order to make the point that it applies across the board. That there are many situations that we find ourselves in art appreciation or art consumption or going around this world of art, where we know we're living a lie for that moment. But a lot of social interaction is like that. It's just, we know that everyone in the room is playing a sort of game. And why, if someone exposed it as a game, why would that be so great? Nasty Rainer on our parade. But on the other hand, it's very important to try and be aware as possible about what are lies and what are truths, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And, Stanley was talking about his sort of success rate of paintings, and I was thinking about, when you're writing or painting or in any endeavour, some things don't work and some things do, and often you can't tell if it's working, and often you have to go through a period where you've got to chuck everything in, then you hone it a bit, then you realise that you are honing, then you're not sure, you get to the end, someone has to come and edit it a bit, or with a painting you might think one is good, or somebody else might think the other is good, and you're not sure anymore, you've been doing it for so long, you become slightly bored with it. You can't remember the initial impulse, the materials are doing their own thing, There are all sorts of odd mind warps and traps and games that you play with yourself in order to achieve a goal of goodness. And when you're making something, it's relatively clear that the aim is it's going to be successful, it's going to be good in the end. But when you're living a life, it's much less clear. And art tells us something, but it's a very at one remove way. It's an allegory or a metaphor for goodness. You've got to sort of get your head around it a bit, and you learn how to understand it and appreciate it just by familiarities. You see more and more, you get used to the feel of it and the texture. The same as maturing in terms of interpersonal relationships. It's pretty weird to begin with. Problems of sex and finances and power and dominance and who is going to be in charge. Can a group work successfully? Can everyone be fulfilled as human beings? Will we have to crush some in order that we can be better? And these are things that take a long time to work out. They're never really resolved. And it's the equivalent with making. So, we happen to live in an incredibly hellish art environment. But as Stanley has, if not stated, he's implied sometimes that it probably always was a bit like that. I mean, the only difference now is that so many more people can join in. It's open to everybody. We can't all be buying it, but we can all get involved somehow. But that just means increased misunderstanding as to what it is. But then it seems like an increased misunderstanding because we had a period of modernism which was the beginning of democracy in art, where many more people than before could get in. But it was still quite elitist. And now elitism is so broken down and everyone must get in. But there's now a complete sort of cacophony of nonsense as to what it is that we're all doing and thinking about and praising. So we think, modernism seems a relatively pure period. There were people really worried about whether a square was right or not next to an oblong, and if it meant socialism or if it meant spirituality, and they would really worry about that. And then before that, there were hundreds of years where it meant Jesus, and only 5 people saw it anyway, so it didn't matter. The peasants all smelling were at the back of the church, and they could only see one of those magnificent Renaissance altarpieces once a year. The shutters would be open, and they'd peer at it, and then it'd be shut again, and they'd have to go back to their piles of mud and dig potatoes and die at age 13. And now we've got the thing where we can be in the room with millionaires, intellectuals, artists, the beautiful, the ugly, the successful, the wannabes. They can all mingle together. But we have a sense that some are millionaires. We have a sense of the injustice and a sense of the abrasive weirdness of us all mingling together. And the question mark at the centre, what is this? Is the art actually in that object, or is it our gathering? And there's a contract between us that we're going to believe that is special? Or, is there some kind of essence of art kept in the National Gallery, and some of that leaks out into Tate Modern, and then some of that leaks out into Stanley's paintings, and some leaks, there's sort of aura emanating out from Leonardo da Vinci, and everyone, none of us know.
But I would say to that, sort of bravo to all of it. We are living in a time where there is so much energy around the art world. It's wonderful. And you talk about the cacophony of, there's everything. I'm lucky enough to live in New York City, where if I want, in 3 hours, I can go through 100 galleries in Chelsea or the Lower East Side. A little more challenging because of the landscape here, but you literally see A to Z. And it doesn't matter, I can hate a show at Gagosian and love a show at some little teeny tiny box. That's irrelevant. But the energy in the world and the number of people making work, I say it's wonderful, all of it. And it's a sort of an ephemeral blurb that doesn't have definition and who's guiding and who's not, but all of it, all of the energy. It's wonderful that we have a society that celebrates art.
Can I ask a question? I have a lot of friends involved in the world of art, and I'm quite a political person, so I'm a humanitarian, but I love art. What do I call myself? I'm a pathological optimist. So I make that choice, obviously, because life is pretty dire in many ways. But after hearing you guys speak, I obviously trying to grasp it intellectually, I get a bit depressed. And what I get depressed about is my idealism about an artist is somebody who lives outside of the box and has the freedom to express what many people do wish to express. And in that, you find some form of inspiration that's reflected back, and that's my idealism. But when you talk about the industry of art, I think, wow, from the way it's sounding, there's a robbery of that freedom, because in terms of how, what the world, the industry of art will give permission to, in terms of the voice behind the artist. So the question is, I don't know if this makes sense, because I'm a bit nervous and I hate microphones, is that actually, what do you believe, because I've heard so many of my friends say, politics should not be a part of be a voice within the world of art, that politics shouldn't be embroiled in the expression of art. And I just wanted to ask your opinion in that.
If we were living in heaven or nirvana, that could be possible. But because human beings are involved, politics are involved. You can't get it out of the equation.
But do you think the world of art supports a political voice within artists?
Sure, and politics are used in art. I mean, there's a lot of, maybe I'm taking this in the wrong way, but a lot of artists make very politically oriented work and become very successful because of that. I try as best I can to not be influenced by either what of my work tends to be selling or what's not. I try to be as forward-thinking and independent as I can, but I don't live in a bubble. I don't live on Gilligan's Island. I live in New York City, and I go to Jersey, and I'm surrounded by 80 other artists, and we're constantly going in and out of each other's studios. And, as best I can, I try and forge ahead again into the unknown, into places where I haven't gone and where nobody's gone. I'm using a tool, to move paint around, trying to make things that, again, will make the hairs in the back of your neck stand up, I hope.
I think at the moment, art with a political conscience is very... it's quite big in the art world generally, as... I spoke earlier about the market, about collectors really driving things and wealth driving things. Well, the one alternative to a sort of nouveau riche, social climbing, collector-driven mindset is political art. So, yes, if you look around a bit, you'll find there's a lot of art that has politics as its theme. And it looks back to a moment in the late 60s and early 70s when political art took a certain form of documentation and videos and rather a sort of expanded way of making art, texts, making art, and bringing in ideas either of... in those days there were certain themes that were looked at, and nowadays it's a different set of themes. Nowadays it's often to do with globalism and financial power and how to fight that, how to fight capitalism, etc. In those days it was civil liberties and the war in Vietnam and gender equality. From the 90s there was political art took the form of sort of awareness of global identity, multiplicity of identities around the world, which is called sort of the neo-colonial turn. And now the issues are often to do with a sort of art version of Occupy, where you look at how to stop an aggressive capitalism or how to live a life that doesn't conform to those values. And so things like the Gagosian Gallery or Frieze Magazine or Art Forum or the Art Market or Sotheby's, they're identified with those capitalist imperatives, and so there's sort of very creative, urgent, breathless, exciting search around the world for alternative types of art to that. I mean, as it happens, I don't personally think that that is the only alternative to collector-driven mindset. I think, a very refined visual beauty could be an alternative, and one could find the politics of a beauty. You could say, well, trying to make something that is beautiful, that could be a political statement. You'd have to work at it. You'd have to explain how it works. Whereas if you have a political art that spells out a political issue, you don't necessarily have to work so hard because it's quite clear in the work. And I don't see. I mean, obviously, Stanley isn't necessarily doing a political type of work, so there are alternatives. I mean, Stanley said he'd like to get in on that big capitalist money-making art machine, and me too. I mean, anyone who makes art, but you want to be in on it and judging it at the same time. I mean, those are the contradictions that you live. I appreciate you're interested in art, but you feel that your social interest is political, and you're interested in art that fits how you see things. And I'm telling you that there's plenty of that stuff. You can find it.
I was just interested because some of my friends are also gallerists, and they're in PR, in art, and they're the ones that were vetoing the concept of that actually it's almost like a death to an artist, because obviously the buyers are so wealthy. So if you're absolutely highlighting the origins of their wealth, you could be killing your career. So I thought that was
true,
quite
actually.
interesting,
Yeah, so,
and I felt like that obviously in the 60s and even in the 80s, there was a lot more freedom of speech attached to the role of the artist, and I was wondering if that was dying because of the lack of questioning.
It's a very intelligently put question, actually, and there's subtle issues there, because the market such a big in the 60s, such a big market as it exists now, of course, did not exist, and there's a lot of political art at the moment, so it's very different forms. You'd be surprised at the range of it, but it is not the most expensive art. And it's not the auction type art. The art that's the most expensive is the stuff that could be thought to be a bit like Picasso. It's mostly painting, sometimes sculpture. It's not so much the other areas of medium. And I can't think of any really immediately identifiably political art that's really up there in the very big league of sales. But a little bit down, I can think of lots. So there is a kind of censorship, but it's not exactly censorship as we know it. It's not that the poor little artist tries to make a political statement and the gallerist smacks their bottom and you better not do that anymore. We evolve. The political artists find the political galleries, really, art can be anything now, and so it's incredibly tolerant, actually, of political art. It's just that the market is not necessarily interested in it at a very high level.
Should we finish up? Thank you so much, Matthew Collings and Stanley Casselman, for coming. And the show finishes on Saturday, so thank you for coming today.
Well done. Very good.